all for being here, now that we have sorted that you are, in fact, in the correct room. So I should begin with something of a disclaimer. When I was asked to speak here, I got so excited about speaking about medieval Islamic philosophy, although now I'm self-conscious about the term medieval. I forgot that I'm not an expert in teaching history, and certainly not in panache. So what you will hear will probably not enlighten you terribly much in teaching history qua history. How I did get into medieval Islamic philosophy, it actually started, I'm a political theorist, but this started more from an interest in religion. I'd lived in rural Morocco for a few years and was just interested in learning more about this religion of my friends and neighbors there. So when I came back, I first studied a bit of Islamic law, and then this led me into this cosmopolitan world, really, of medieval philosophy, from Al-Farabi to Ibn Rushd, who's Averroes, whom I'll be speaking more on later, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Khaldun, Avicenna, the sort of big names. These then have been my companions, really, for the past several years, even as I've also attempted to branch out into their Jewish contemporaries and maintain some level of fluency in their Christian counterparts that had been my sort of bread and butter before my graduate studies. Still, none of this really qualifies me to speak on history, or teaching history, for sure. So what I usually do is pore over some of these texts and then attempt to glean some wisdom from them, which is what I'm going to, mimic an attempt of today. So as I've alluded, there's really no shortage of medieval Arabic and Islamic thinkers and authors of great books, thinkers really of the first caliber to choose from. So they're a diverse set from the 9th century, sort of free-thinking philosopher and also physician, Razi, who's from present-day Tehran, to the Baghdad Peripatetics, including both Muslims like Al-Farabi and Al-Sijistani, as well as Christians like Ibn Abi, who in fact was taught by Farabi, and Abu Bishr Mata. These were peripatetics really to the bone. They were building on the Aristotelian corpus, debating the merits of Aristotle's contribution to this new world order that was wrought in part by Islam, but also simply carrying on the peripatetic tradition. There's also, of course, the nearly unparalleled Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna, this 11th century polymath from present-day Uzbekistan. They're really from all over, the Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, eventually. His original philosophical contributions had profound influences on Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions for centuries to come. But these later centuries of the so-called Islamic Golden Age of philosophy, so the 9th to 14th centuries AD, they brought the intellectual rivalry in the 11th to 12th centuries of the Persian jurist, theologian, mystic, and sometimes philosopher Al-Ghazali, who would do a great deal really to end the flourishing of medieval philosophy within the Islamic tradition, especially through his Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. And the rivalry between him and a generation later, so maybe not an in-time rivalry, the Andalusian imam and judge, religious judge, Ibn Rushd, known of course as Averroes, who would then write a defense of philosophy, even a religious defense of philosophy, known as Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence. I think this might have been a little bit too little too late, as at least this is how the story goes anyway. The Mu'tazilite rationalist tradition had been more or less by then overtaken by the Ash'ari, very roughly speaking, voluntarist tradition within theology and law, Islamic law. So by the time Averroes died in 1198, this was sort of, the golden age was really starting to come to an end already. But Averroes, nevertheless, is, I argue, a pivotal and essential figure for understanding the place of philosophy and even just human wisdom within Islam. He's a great figure for this because he was at once a religious leader. So he was the Qadi al-Qada, which means like the chief judge, the judge of judges of Cordoba. And of course, he's the judge of Islamic law, of Sharia. So he has a preeminent place within his Islamic community of the time. But he was also such a prolific commentator on Aristotle's works. He was so immersed in the Hellenistic tradition that he was simply called the commentator. He wrote on every one of Aristotle's works, except, curiously, the Politics, which he said has not yet fallen into our hands. So he substituted Plato's Republic and wrote a commentary on that. I don't know if he was just being cagey or what. But Averroes produced original works as well, some apologetic in nature, such as the piece I'm addressing for the rest of this talk, which is known as The Decisive Treatise, determining what is the connection between wisdom and law. That's the most literal rendering of it, in which wisdom is hikmah. So it's the same word that gets used for philosophy more broadly. Falsafa is the Hellenistic tradition, but hikmah is just wisdom or philosophy. So, and law in there, so it's determining the connection between wisdom and law, so between philosophy and sharia, which is religious law, which is the most authoritative body of knowledge for Islam. So this is, as opposed to theology, perhaps within Christianity, law is, of course, the preeminent authoritative source of knowledge. So I was drawn to this particular treatise because after working with some other texts by Averroes for a few years, I wanted to understand the larger picture of Averroes' understanding of the relationship between religion and philosophy, even between religion and reason. I taught for a year. I was still in graduate school in Qatar, in Doha, and I had a student there. This is right during the rise of ISIS, really. And I had a student there who was himself a very devout Muslim, and he spoke of me in office hours about how the Muslim community to him was to understand al-Baghdadi's claims, right? Like he is the new caliph, he is the true interpreter of Islam. And despite the obviously bloody and terrifying nature of this, self-styled caliphate, he said, well, we had to take it seriously. Of course, this is, his and his family's interpretation. There are many others. But he said we had to take it seriously, because there were actually some markings here. We had to sort out if this is a valid claim. They did eventually determine, no, it's not. This is a usurper. But the idea is that he needed some real resources in understanding his own tradition and the relationship between revealed law and what we can know by reason, which is surely violent usurpation is a bad thing. So in my then interpretation of this text, which I finally arrived at a few years later, Averroes achieves this harmony. The work is sometimes referred to the harmony of religion and law. Of law and philosophy, by taking as axiomatic the proposition that truth does not contradict truth. Religious truth will not contradict philosophical truth, and then working out a religious epistemology from this. So the text begins, and this is after the typical dedication to God, the merciful and compassionate, and a prayer for peace for Muhammad. So it's very clearly marking itself out as a religious work. The text begins with a query as to whether, and this is a quote, reflection upon philosophy and the sciences of logic is, and these are technical legal terms, permitted, prohibited, or commanded, and this, whether permitted, prohibited, or commanded, as a recommendation or an obligation by the Sharia, by the divine law. In other words, what is the status of philosophy in divine law? The word is reflection, so it can be more broadly interpreted than philosophy, but this is what he's getting to. So to answer this, Averroes takes the reader through several steps. First, he notes that the divine law not only permits, but indeed commands reflection. Consider, you who have sight. This is from the Quran, 59, which Averroes takes as a text for, this is a quote, a text for the obligation of using both intellectual and law-based, sharia-based, syllogistic reasoning. So reflection of some variety is therefore legally obligatory. Not just recommended, but you are obligated to reflect. But, says Averroes, this is again a quote, consideration is nothing more than inferring and drawing out the unknown from the known, and this is syllogistic reasoning. And this manner of reflection, syllogistic reasoning, the law calls for and urges, is the most complete kind of reflection, and this is the one called demonstration. So theoretical demonstration being sort of the highest level of philosophical reasoning out. So in order to, and that's the end of the quote, in order to carry out the reflection called for by the divine law, that is, one must use this theoretical demonstration, i.e. all of the philosophical resources you can summon. There will, of course, and Averroes predicts, be detractors to this interpretation of the whole of Sharia based on a single Quranic injunction. So Averroes anticipates this by saying, it is not for someone to say, now this kind of reflection about intellectual syllogistic reasoning is a heretical innovation, since it, that kind of reflection, this kind of philosophy, did not exist in the earliest days of Islam. It's worth noting that this would eventually come to be called, centuries later, the Salafi interpretation, right? If it didn't exist in the early days of Islam or for Muhammad or for his companions, it is illegitimate for us. But Averroes dismisses this objection for, he continues, reflection upon juridical syllogistic reasoning and its kinds is also something inferred after the earliest days. Yet it, that is, juridical syllogistic reasoning, is not opined to be a heretical innovation. So it is obligatory to believe the same about reflection upon intellectual syllogistic reasoning. And I think this seems right, at least at first glance. If one can innovate, as it were, juridical reasoning, so law-based reasoning, why not intellectual or philosophical reasoning? In other words, neither one existed at the time of the prophet, so it's okay. If we are all okay, and I think all of the legal schools were okay with syllogistic reasoning from one case to the next case. You know, this is considered haram or this is considered obligatory, and we can reason by way of syllogism to get to this other case, so this is still the same thing as, or this like thing is also haram or is obligatory. This is okay. That is perfectly accepted in all of the legal schools. Therefore, we should be able to use syllogisms and reason about anything, right? But I think Averroes might be just a little bit cagey here. There is actually reason in Islamic law for juridical syllogistic reasoning, which is that that's the reasoning that you do that is based upon revealed sources. So you would start from the Sharia or the Hadith, the sayings about the Prophet Muhammad, sayings and doings, and maybe of his companions. There are also secondary sources that you can build on, and these vary by Islamic legal school. But the idea is that the syllogisms, the syllogistic reasoning, will be based on things that are revealed to be good or to be evil, to be allowed, to be forbidden, etc. Whereas if you are using syllogistic intellectual reasoning, you might be reasoning about anything. So you might be reasoning just about the nature of good and evil, or about whether the world is created or eternal, which is a huge controversy of the day. And as anyone from the Athenian jury to the Spanish Inquisition might attest, this kind of reasoning can be dangerous in a religious community. And I don't think that Averroes is in any way unaware of this. He ends this sort of parallel between juridical reasoning and intellectual reasoning with, for this there is a reason, but this is not the place to mention it. So he then switches from this juridical reasoning, intellectual reasoning parallel, now to one between intellectual and practical tools. So, and this is, I'm sorry, a rather long quote. If someone other than us has already investigated a given matter, it is evidently obligatory for us to rely on what the one who has preceded us says about what we are pursuing, regardless of whether that person shares our religion or not. So, for instance, when a valid sacrifice is performed by means of a tool, no consideration is given with respect to the validity of the sacrifice as to whether the tool belongs to someone who shares in our religion or not, so long as the sacrifice fulfills the conditions for validity. And by not sharing in our religion, I mean those ancients who reflected upon these things before the religion of Islam. In other words, if we can perform physical sacrifices using tools that were invented by non-Muslims, and especially by those who came before the advent of Islam, surely we can use intellectual tools that predated Islam, the works of Aristotle, for instance. Again, he might be papering over a very real distinction between the uprightness of using a physical tool towards a manifestly Islamic end, right, the sacrifice that is prescribed by the law, and on the other hand, using intellectual tools to arrive at we don't know what, right, to arrive at perhaps very un-Islamic conclusions. So he's making, this is an apologetic piece, right? I mean, he's not presenting the strongest case for the other side. And I think that his defense of the harmony of philosophy and religion is, in the overall work, all things considered, still quite strong. Even if we do buy this argument, though, it does appear that not everyone is obligated to study philosophy, despite the Quranic injunctions cited above, though everyone is obligated to assent to the law, so is required to assent to the Sharia. Now, for some, that will be through reflection and through philosophy. They will understand the truth of Sharia because they will have the fullness of wisdom through theoretical demonstration, or the fullest that we as humans can get. For others, though, it will depend on people's natures, which vary in excellence with respect to assent, says Averroes. Thus, and this is a quote, some assent by means of demonstration. These, of course, would be the philosophers. I'm papering over a lot of distinctions here, but that would be the philosopher. Some assent by means of dialectical statements, there being nothing greater in their natures. So there are some who can understand dialectic, but they can't understand real philosophical demonstration. And some assent by means of rhetorical statements. So those who will be persuaded by rhetoric, but maybe cannot get intellectually past that level. These differences in people's innate dispositions, it's his term, which is a common Islamic term, fitra, and levels of ability to understand argumentation mean that the presentation of religious truths must respect these modes. So for those who are able to understand demonstration, they can understand this harmony of philosophy and law. For those who can only understand through rhetoric, and here I'm reading in a little bit of Al-Farabi into Averroes, but he does suggest similar things in this work, they perhaps should just be persuaded by religious rhetoric. So perhaps this philosophy really is not for everyone. Otherwise, sects and divisions will arise among the Muslim community as people will be attempting to understand things that are beyond their grasps. And this is the whole ending part of the decisive treatise, is why not everyone should be presented with the same level of demonstration or philosophy. Nevertheless, Averroes is confident that, and here's another quote, since this law is true, so since the Sharia is true and calls to the reflection leading to cognizance of the truth, i.e. it calls to philosophy, we, the Muslim community, know firmly that demonstrative reflection, the highest form of philosophical reasoning, does not lead to differing with what is set down in the Sharia. For, he avers, truth does not oppose truth, rather it agrees with it and bears witness to it. So this is, again, this is his strongest statement, I think, in the text, and probably the most famous as well. And on the matter of teaching this, I find it productive to ask a few things. First, whether it matters that Averroes begins this whole presentation with a Quranic injunction, right? So, you know, the obligation to study philosophy is established through a divine command, such as, he says, Quran 59:2, consider you who have sight, and so on. And he says, innumerable other verses. The task of philosophy is therefore not justified on its own terms. It is not justified because we should just love wisdom as human beings. Rather, it is justified because reflection is commanded by God. So I find it helpful to ask students, does this matter? Does it matter why we study philosophy? Does our study of philosophy, does the reasoning for it matter? Might we incline one way or the other if we were doing this because God commanded it versus we want to learn, full stop? We could also ask whether Averroes thinks that, but he's presenting a decidedly legal case here. In fact, he describes his task in the decisive treatise to be, quote, to investigate from the perspective of Sharia-based reflection, whether reflection upon hikmah, upon philosophy, and the sciences of logic is prohibited or required, or commanded by the law. In other words, the fundamental question of inquiry prior to what philosophy itself says is whether the Sharia commands it or allows it in the first place. So that's one question that I find students usually will kind of grasp. The other one, for a more politically oriented group, is what I call the sort of epistemic elitism in this text. Even though, for Averroes, all people can know some truth, some of them will only know it through divine revelation, right? Does this matter? Does it matter for his own text? Does it matter in the democratic age in which we live, right? So there are some parts of the law that are clearly intended to be taken in their apparent sense, but there are other parts of the law that need interpretation. Does it matter that even making that judgment call, much less the interpretation itself, must be done by elites? This is wholly unexceptional for his time, of course. We find the same thing in Farabi, we find the same thing in Aristotle, we find it all throughout. But it might matter in a democratic age. So of what use is the harmony if only the intellectual elites have the ability and also, importantly, authority to show that philosophy is in harmony with the law, to go beyond the question of just what the law says itself. So I hope that this very brief glimpse into what I think is one of the greatest minds of the medieval Islamic thought has provided at least some inspiration for teaching medieval moments with panache, probably less panache, as we saw our audience members leave. But it is really just a sliver into what I think is a treasure trove of largely underdiscovered texts and a tradition that is so, I think, accessible to the Western canon, but often not taught alongside it. Thinkers that have a great deal to say, not only about, of course, the issues of their time and the commentaries of Aristotle and maybe Plato, the eternal or created nature of the world, but also really about our own. I mean, the relationship between reason and revelation, the nature of the good, the nature of justice. So thank you all very much.